John McMullen from 97.3 ESPN.com. And he also covers the league nationally. FanRag NFL, where a lot of NFL news as we are getting into that first week, John, of the post-Super Bowl. And this is the week that the veteran players don't like, right? This is the week where they are kind of on their toes waiting for the Grim Reaper to knock on their door and tell them, thanks for your services, you're no longer here. This is the first week of the kind of that down period for the players that they don't like.
Yeah, a lot of veteran guys really throughout the month before the new league year starts, all contracts now are basically structured that if you have guaranteed money, roster bonus, it's all going to come at that particular time. So that's when teams have to make decisions, and difficult decisions. And they have to say, do we want you back at this particular number, or do we want to move on? And that's why you see all the veterans getting released this time of year.
Yeah, this is where the teams really, John, and you could probably explain this better, this is where the teams kind of start their offseason blueprint in terms of freeing up cash and also giving you a little bit of an indication of their offseason blueprints and their plans of which areas they thought were not good the year before, a la the Eagles starting over, it looks like, at corner.
Yeah, you can certainly see teams sort of highlight what they need by the decisions they make. And obviously, from the Eagles' standpoint, if you think about the fact that they're releasing their best cornerback, it tells you that they don't have very good cornerbacks. Same thing happened in Green Bay with Sam Shields, who had a lot of concussion issues, but you saw all the difficulties they had at the cornerback position. They know they need to get better there as well. So you see it in cities all across the country.
Yeah, John, and we're going to get into some of the guys who have been released and some of the other NFL news that is happening here, because you're starting to see some guys already. And, the first thing that happens, what happens when you start to see veteran names released? You start to say, oh, would this guy be a fit? And of some of these veteran guys, are a lot of these guys cut mainly because they can't play anymore, or because they can't they make too much money?
It's usually a combination of both. It's usually teams feel they're either descending and not deserving of the money they're scheduled to get, but it doesn't necessarily mean they can't play in the NFL. I think, to use Leotis as an example,
right.
He belongs on an NFL team, probably as a third or a fourth corner. But the Eagles specifically know they need improvement at that particular position. You have to open up spots. You're going to add bodies. You want to improve, and they don't want to pay a fourth corner $3.5 million, especially when you think about the lack of salary cap space they have to begin with. So they're a team that needs to create space in general. So all these things kind of enter into the equation. A team like Cleveland, for instance, which has a ton of money, they don't need to create any space. So if they cut somebody, it's because they don't want them on their particular team.
Yeah, and we just saw DeQuell Jackson released from the Indianapolis Colts yesterday, Sam Shields. So there's some veteran, bigger-name guys who were making some money. We also saw James Starks, who seems like he's been with the Packers, since Lombardi coached that team. Had been there for so long, but he got released yesterday. So you're starting to see some interesting names that will hit the market. We'll see if the Eagles are a player in that type of free agent market at all, John, because yesterday, as we kind of talked about Leotis McKelvin, Howie Roseman had said, hey, we've been going with the Band-Aid approach at corner, and Leotis McKelvin is kind of the poster child for, hey, we went Band-Aid route to try to fix. So you wonder if that's a route that they're not interested in going anymore, that mid-tier, mid-level free agent, and trying to, it seems that what they've done over the last couple of years is signed a guy who had an interesting resume and hope that they got the highest end of the ceiling on that resume, a la McKelvin, who was a first-round pick at one point and has just constantly been injured. But if he lives up to it, his resume was, he's going to be really good. It seems like they've been burned on that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I agree with Howie and the Band-Aid theory because, let's be honest, every team in this league has Band-Aids. You can't solve every problem on your roster in one specific offseason, and that goes from the New England Patriots on down, all the way to the Cleveland Browns. Every single team in this league has Band-Aids because you can't have a star at every position. The salary cap limits that, and you need role players. You need guys to step in. So at a particular position like the Eagles, who have struggled so much at the cornerback position, maybe you say that because you're thinking, man, we got to find a top-tier corner, whether it's in the draft or free agency, and then sort of place the Band-Aids behind that. That's what the Eagles have been lacking because, let's face it, you would think now that Leotis is gone, the Eagles will try to bring back Nolan Carroll at a sensible price, and I think that will be their attempt. But he's a Band-Aid. I mean, Nolan Carroll isn't any superstar of any nature, so you always have those.
Right, he was their Band-Aid. He was the Band-Aid they brought in 2 years ago.
Yeah, and by the way, he's worked out pretty well as a Band-Aid type player. And you understand the expectations are not off the charts when you bring in a guy like that. And I just think, be careful when you say that if you're Howie Roseman, because you're going to have to bring in Band-Aids. And if all of a sudden you start boasting about not wanting that type of player, well, then you can't really put together a roster in this league because, as I said, it's impossible to have a star player at every position.
John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com. John, before we get to some of the other news and notes, I do want to get into your story that you wrote at FanRagSports.com NFL, and it's about T.O. and the Hall of Fame snub, which, we discussed a lot earlier in the week. Yesterday, or I guess it was on Tuesday's show, we had Paul Domowitch, who is a voter, and he, I thought he did a really good job. It was very truthful and forthcoming about that process, and I felt like, okay, you get a pretty good look at what goes on in that room. And then you have a guy like Dan Fouts, who was a player and really came out and said, look, I think he got a fair shake, and again, I got to start scratching.
Fair evaluation.
Yes, fair evaluation, and I got to start scratching my head. You wrote about this for your column at FanRagSports.com NFL. You say this is business as usual, which I agree with. But, when it feels like, again, that they got this off base and that some people are holding grudges. And Domowitch said one of the layers, one of the pillars is, the guy, I guess, in the locker room. Should that be one of the reasons that they evaluate when they're looking at these guys as their playing career?
Well, it's not only something they should, it's something they're told to evaluate. That's in their instructions. They're told to evaluate players as teammates and how they act in the locker room. On the other hand,
but here's the interesting part. He said, and this is where I found it to be interesting, and what you just said, they're told to do that, but they're not told to evaluate them if they hit a woman or were a drink, which is ludicrous, right? If you're going to evaluate them on that, wouldn't you think that like that guy is a worse guy than a guy who just happened to be a jerk in the locker room?
I don't know, not necessarily, and I'll tell you why I don't agree with. Because, and I've always argued this, whether it's O.J. Simpson or the most horrible case you can imagine. It's a Hall of Fame for best football players. It's not a Hall of Fame for best people. So whether you want to talk about Ty Cobb and baseball, whether you want to talk about Pete Rose, who I've always advocated should be in, no matter what. If you want to ban him from the game, ban him from the game. But he should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame because he's one of the best baseball players that ever lived. It's not a Hall of Fame for best people. It, however, is a Hall of Fame for best football players. And your impact in the locker room has an effect on your level as a football player, whereas if you do something, even something egregious off the field, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what you do on the field. So I understand why casual fans don't see the difference, but I do see the difference, and I think it's a correct one. And I've criticized the Hall of Fame voters a lot over the years, but not for that. I don't think they should take into account whether it's domestic violence or whether it's Lawrence Taylor. Pete mentioned him earlier in the week and some of his issues because it has nothing to do with him as a football player. Now, if you want me to rate him as a human being, it's probably going to be pretty low, but that's different.
John, when he does the tweet that he did right after the vote came out and finishes it with the hashtag flawed process, isn't that just pouring gasoline on the fire and maybe it's going to cause him to take even longer to get in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. But by the way, I will never say there's not any personal agendas in that room because I think there is, and I've seen them numerous times over the years. And I'm sure Paul said there wasn't. I've talked to him often. He says there isn't. I talked to Peter King about it. He says there isn't. I disagree with him. There's no question these guys bring personal biases to the table. And that's why I brought up Paul Krause in my column today, because I think it's very comparable as a home run choice because of his statistics. And everyone brings up T.O.'s statistics. Paul Krause is the all-time interception leader, and it took him 15 years to get in the Hall of Fame. People held the fact that it wasn't off-the-field issues because he's a model citizen. They held the fact that he lost a bunch of Super Bowls. And, I often joke, if he wasn't 0-4 in Super Bowls, if he didn't get Danny, he would have been a first-ballot Hall of Famer. Now, what sense does that make? But it's just everybody's got their agendas, and when you have a subjective process, it turns into this. What I tried to write about today, though, is I don't understand the uproar about T.O. Everyone is like, this is the first time it's happened. It happens every year. So the fact that it's happening with Owens, who played on 6 different teams, which no matter what you hear from the revisionist history of Donovan McNabb or anybody else is coming out and saying, no, T.O. is a great teammate. If T.O. was a great teammate for the majority of his career, he's not playing on 6 NFL teams. It's as simple as that.
Well,
You're not that good as a player.
That's something that Fouts brought up, that he played on so many teams and why. But Moss played on 5 teams. Owens. Moss played for 5 teams. And if Moss gets in, wouldn't that be a clear indication that they're holding a vendetta against Owens for it? Because Moss played for 5 teams as well, and their numbers are, in fact, we did this the other day. Owens' numbers across the board are better than Moss's.
Well, I think, and I said today, I think Randy's going to face a lot of the same hurdles that T.O. does because he hurt himself with the way he acted at times in his career. So I don't think he's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. I think he should be, but I don't think he will for the same reason.
No question he should be, by the way.
I agree. Talent-wise, there's no question. I said in my column, talent-wise, there's no question with T.O. But people are going to remember him forcing his way out of Minnesota, him just really checking out with the Oakland Raiders, talking about Randy. Yeah, they're going to remember that, and I think they're going to hold it against him for at least a couple of years. But as I said, that's the way they've always done business. So nothing has changed. My point is I don't understand why T.O. has set off this controversy where everyone looks at it and says this is the first time it's happened, and they're sort of singling out this guy. It's happened for years and years and years and years, and it will continue to happen.
Well, it just seems that Owens is just so clearly an egregious miss. And a modern era egregious miss.
Well, and that's why I brought up Krause, who is still in the modern era. Remember, there's a slam dunk Hall of Famer, who lasted 14 years before they let him in. 14 years. So to say T.O.'s a slam dunk Hall of Famer, which I agree with, by the way, from a talent standpoint. To say it's never happened before is just not true. It's just not true.
Well, I guess with wide receivers, there's tangible rankings, like you're second in yards, you're second in touch, or he's second in yards, he's third in touchdowns. There's a tangible list that you can look up and say, look, this guy.
That's what I'm saying. The tangible list is when Krause retired in, I believe, 1979, 81 interceptions, all-time leader. Now think about that. 1979, we're now in the year 2016. That record still stands. That record still stands. Nobody's close. It may never be broken. It took him 14 years to get in the Hall of Fame.
John McMullen with us. Not easy to get into Canton is the moral of that story. How much then, John, do you think that Randy Moss, because here's the difference right now, at least from Randy Moss and Terrell Owens, is Randy Moss is now a member of the media. Does that maybe play a factor into him getting in there because people see him on the television on a regular basis? They see him as a media representative now more than maybe they see him as a player.
Yeah, it is possible because he can forge relationships with a lot of people that vote, and if they decide he's a pretty good guy, it could help him. So I do think that's something that could happen. And as I said, there are personal biases. There's no question in my mind. And I think there are some voters that think T.O.'s a jerk, and that's why they didn't vote for him. I would never dismiss that out of line. But the only thing I was trying to frame is the fact that he's hardly the first guy this has happened to, and he'll hardly be the last.
John, I came across an article yesterday about high-scoring offenses and the Atlanta Falcons and the theme, because you mentioned the Super Bowl a couple minutes ago. High-scoring offenses, and the Falcons had a 500-point offense. That's like the gold standard. They were 19th team in the Super Bowl era to finish the season with 500-plus points on offense, and yet they did not win the game. Why does a high-powered offense not guarantee you a Super Bowl victory?
Well, we always talk about the cliche defense wins championships, and generally it comes down to that in the end. Although I think the Atlanta Falcons offense did enough to win that football game. So there are a lot of the issue was how explosive they were in the first half of that game, and it hurt them a little bit. As I mentioned earlier in the week, it was sort of a Chip Kelly offensive game when everything was going right. And you're scoring, and you're not only scoring, you're scoring quickly, and you're generating all the explosive plays, but all of a sudden the time of possession is really slanted towards the opponent. Your defense is out there for an extraordinary amount of plays because you're not having those grinded out clock drives. And they were dead in the water defensively in the fourth quarter. They had nothing left. They were spent. So that contributed to it. But there's a lot of reasons you could say why the Atlanta Falcons aren't the Super Bowl champions today. You could look at the play calling of Kyle Shanahan. You could look at Matt Ryan and a Pro Bowl MVP player not understanding situational football. And you can look at luck, too. I mean, the Edelman play, Alford is really close to intercepting that football. There's three Falcons there, and somehow it lays in the hands of Julian Edelman. So a lot of things had to go right for the Patriots to win that game, and they all did.
It's funny. 7 of the teams that finished the season with at least 500 points didn't even make it to the Super Bowl game. And then the teams that you remember, the 94 49ers, 98 Broncos, 99 Rams, 2009 New Orleans Saints, the only teams to score 500 points in a season and go on and actually win the Super Bowl. You just think if you have that gold standard of offense and the league is ripping up the playbook left and right to try, and the rules left and right to try and get more offense into the game, and yet the championships tend to be won by the team that has the defense.
Yeah, and remember, the gold standard of them all, the Denver Broncos with Peyton Manning, they were the only team to score 600 points. And they did make the Super Bowl, but they got waxed by the Seattle Seahawks, the defensive team. So they make it easier, it seems, with the rules to play offense in this league. every single year. But then as you get late in the season, all of a sudden, especially if you're an East Coast team or a Midwest team, and you play outdoors, all of a sudden you start thinking about your defense and your running game and more conventional football. And maybe if they played over the summer and the Super Bowl was in September, maybe some of these 500, 600-point teams would win the Super Bowl more often. But it seems like as you get later in the season, just the nature of it, it tends to shift towards defense and old school football.
John, just last thing real quick. When you look at the Hall of Fame, I guess the good thing about this Hall of Fame snub is that it is, I think, brought the Pro Football Hall of Fame to the, the forefront, because the Pro Football Hall of Fame is one of those things. It comes out, everybody gets acknowledged, and then it seems like it just kind of goes away, right? I mean, the baseball one, it seems like there's heated debates on a lot of times, but this is really the first time that the football one, I feel like, has had a carryover of people really saying, wow, they got this wrong.
Yeah, well, I think there's always debate, but I think you're right. I think the Baseball Hall of Fame, because of a lot of reasons. I mean, if you think the absurdity of the Baseball Hall of Fame and that, I always say, until you put Barry Bonds in and Roger Clemens in, hey, that's the best player and the best pitcher of my generation. Neither are in the Hall of Fame because these voters think they know who took steroids and who didn't. And I don't. So I know they don't, but they seem to be making moral justifications and moral choices. And I think it's absurd. So for a lot of reasons, the controversy is more in baseball, and I think football has taken away from that. But within the sport, there's always been controversies, like I said, and people talk about it every year. And if it wasn't T.O., a lot of people don't want Terrell Davis in the Hall of Fame because his stint as a superstar player was basically 4 years, and they don't like the longevity issue, and even to a certain extent, Kurt Warner. So there's always controversies. I think but that's why I sort of wrote about it. For whatever reason, because so many people like Terrell Owens, he's sparked this talk more than most people, but it's really been around for a very long time. And guys like Tim Brown, Marvin Harrison, Chris Carter at that particular position, it's very hard if you think about it, guys, because you mentioned T.O.'s second in receptions, third in touchdowns. Because of the way the game is played, those numbers are going to be broken pretty quickly. And that's not to say T.O.'s not a great player. It's just the game has shifted so much that those numbers aren't going to look nearly as good, say, 15 years from now. It's still going to be the same player. So I think a lot of voters have difficulty gauging the greatness of wide receivers.
All right, good stuff from John. Read that article at FanRag Sports NFL on T.O. and business as usual in the NFL. More NFL news and notes tomorrow. We're sure more guys could be on the unemployment line, and where they could end up, we'll talk with John tomorrow here on the Sports Bash. Take care, pal.
Hey, thanks, guys.